inquiry. I should remind you that this is a public session and we're being broadcast live. In a couple of days you will receive a transcript of the session so that you'll have the opportunity to make any minor corrections of things that have come out inaccurately or wrong. But also feel free to follow up whatever you're going to say today to us live in writing afterwards if there's anything you'd like to submit then. We've obviously got a lot of questions for you, and perhaps before you start giving your first answer, each of you could introduce yourselves so that we've got that on record as well. Okay, so I'm going to kick off with the first question, and that is, are there any particular criteria or factors that editors take into account when they're deciding whether or how to report on a potential or active threat, crisis or emergency? And more broadly, is there a particular role or responsibility that the media have in terms of building national resilience or scrutinising government and identifying risks early, perhaps through investigative journalism? I know that's a big question, but perhaps we could just start with that. And could I start with Deborah, perhaps? Sorry, Elizabeth.
Hi.
Yeah, Deborah. Yes. Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong person. Yeah, Deborah.
No worries. Good morning. So my name's Deborah Haynes, and I am the security and defence editor at Sky News. And I have been a journalist now for almost 30 years, and ever since really 2004, when I first went to report in Iraq, I have had a particular focus on defence, security, conflict, and the evolution of the character of war over that time, and the evolution of the threat, which I try to sort of bring into the work that I do. And over that time, of course, I used to be the defence editor for the Times before I moved to Sky. So I've had a lot of experience of being in a media organisation covering crises and conflict. And in terms of your first question about how editors and news organisations deal with coverage of a crisis or an emergency, sometimes it's very obvious that there has been a critical incident. I mean, you can talk, for example, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It was very, very obvious from early on, actually, in terms of the information that we were receiving, that the UK and the US very much believed that Russia was going to launch its full-scale war of Ukraine. And so I can talk from a Sky perspective. We, immediately had a lot of resource that we dedicated to ensure that we could cover that conflict as expansively and as most in-depth as possible, which included forward deploying teams on the ground, as well as all of the architecture that you need back home to be able to deliver 24 hours a day, daily news, including breaking news. Other times, though, it's not always immediately obvious just how critical an emergency is, and especially when you're talking about hybrid attacks, cyber attacks. I can remember the Skripal poisoning. I was at the Times when that happened. And initially, we didn't really know what was going on. And it was only through the first few hours that you begin to understand, just from the response from the emergency services, that this isn't just an ordinary incident, that this is something far more critical. And then, of course, you rely very heavily on contacts within government to be able to speak to journalists and explain to them that this is something different. This is something of national and actually international significance. And then when you have like trusted journalists in these news organisations, that it's our bread and butter covering defence and security. And so we do have that good relationship with our bosses and are able to say to them, I've had many conversations where I'll speak to a sort of a senior line manager and say, this is hugely important. This is something that we need to make space for. And those relationships, we've been doing this for a long time. People will listen and then make space for it. But like I say, bottom line is it's not always obvious. When it becomes obvious, then you have the specialist journalists in place that are able to ensure that our bosses understand. And actually, quite often, the senior editors at Sky, and when I was at the Times, were very, very grounded and understood and experienced in terms of national emergencies and crisis and war. And so it was usually a very easy conversation to get their attention. And then in terms of the second part of your question about the role that the media plays in helping to raise national awareness about the importance of rebuilding resilience, it's critically important. It's a subject that, unfortunately, in the UK has become, thankfully, because of the end of the Cold War, more of an alien idea. People are not familiar with the idea of the need to be resilient. Yes, people talk about resilience to floods. There's great systems in place to deal with warnings and indicators and individual responsibility if you're living in an area where you could be at risk to flooding. There's much greater awareness about cyber threats and the need to make sure that you've got constantly, antivirus software on your computers and your other tablets. But when it comes to Article 3, NATO Article 3, prepared for war, transition to war, all of that language that was part of the national dialogue during the Cold War, when everybody had a much greater awareness about what would happen to their country should it be attacked, or should it be involved in some kind of Article 3 confrontation with the then Soviet Union. And all of that contained in the government war book, which is something that at Sky News we've done a lot of reporting on. Unfortunately, that has been widely forgotten. And I think that's something that I know through lots of our reporting in news organisations now are increasingly focused on doing and trying to help raise awareness about this really important need to relearn the past.
Thank you. Could we turn to Edward Lucas now, please?
Yes, thanks very much for the invitation. I've been a journalist now for more than 40 years, working for the BBC, The Economist and other publications. I've been a war correspondent, a foreign correspondent. I've also done senior editing jobs. So I think the first thing to say in answering your question is there's never enough time, there's never enough space, as in space on the page or airtime, and there's never enough money. And so you're always trying to compromise, work within these constraints. The second is it's a competitive environment. It's competitive within whatever news organisation you're working on, and it's competitive between news organisations. It's hard to be unfashionable, and you very rapidly get a reputation as a crank if you start pushing stuff that may be completely true, and in 10 years' time everyone will say you're completely right, but that doesn't help you if you lose your job at the time. Mm-hmm. And a good example of this is our coverage of Russia, where we were, throughout the 90s, convinced that Russia was a friend and a good emerging market. We were convinced that Putin was a very promising development. And as one of the 2 or 3 foreign correspondents in Moscow who took a different line, I got the full-on pressure from the British establishment to shut up because I was bad for business. So my final point is that journalists are part of a wider ecosystem. They work in an environment where advertisers have their priorities, where governments have their priorities, where customers and people who consume the news have their priorities. And so you may not like the way the media is covering something, but usually the reason for that is not the blame should not land with the media. The media reflects the society and the government that it covers.
Thank you. Elizabeth Brewer.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the invitation. And can I congratulate all the members on being members of this committee, which is so important, and I think we're all delighted that it has been established. So my name is Elizabeth Brewer. I'm a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council. A long time ago, I was a journalist, but for the past over a decade, I've been an academic focusing on new national security threats and societal resilience. So in this period, it has been fascinating to watch the interest grow, and has grown alongside the threats and the acts of aggression, which are now growing very rapidly, so that the committee is desperately needed. When it comes to news media, what I would add to what Deborah and Edward have already said is another side of the reporting, namely, so they both addressed the need for more reporting, but there's the other side, which is how much can you report? So if you look at the Cold War, there were arrangements or agreements between governments and news media about what was acceptable to report. And in some cases, those agreements still exist. There was an arrangement, I don't remember it, but I know that it existed, called the grey slip, which is something that the government instructed newspaper editors via a grey slip that it would be a good idea not to report about that particular matter. And I would like to know in various countries to what extent such arrangements still exist. Obviously they are classified, so it's hard to know from the public domain, but I think that will become more and more important as the aggression against our countries increase, and the temptation exists for news media to report as much as they can, which is their job, but there may be a risk that sensitive information then gets out that would harm national security. So that's something that I think will become increasingly important, and I hope that the committee will look at.
Thank you very much. Lady Hellich.
Thank you.
Sorry, before we get there, did you have a follow-up on this question?
Yeah, thanks very much for attending today. We really value your contribution. The term fake news has become fairly ubiquitous and does seem to be undermining trust in legitimate journalism and news communication. And I was quite struck by the term crank, because over past decades that's been associated with some activism and climate change. How do you balance, and it's been undermined, how do you get the facts out there while still maintaining that demand for balance and independence, where you can communicate clearly what is happening and you've got clear evidence to support that, but you get attacked because it's not balanced or it's not independent?
Does anybody have an answer to that one?
I mean, we could all sit down and do a master's degree in this, and we wouldn't be done by the end of the year. It's a huge subject. First of all, I don't like the term fake news. It's become just an epithet used for news we don't like. I think the key thing that's happened is that technology has removed the media's gatekeeping function. It used to be you had 3 buttons on your telly and half a dozen newspapers on the newsstand, and that was pretty much it. And we now, you can, from an iPhone on the other side of the world, you can run a global disinformation campaign. And there's all sorts of things we can say about that. And I would start with the why we privilege anonymity so much. And I think that it was a disaster when, for example, the social media platform X removed its blue tick system, which meant you had a rough idea that when you saw that someone was tweeting as Baroness Winston of Doncaster, that really was Baroness Winston of Doncaster. As it is, I could, in the time we've been talking, I could have set up an account on X, claimed to be this committee, and you would be then faced with a sort of wearisome business of trying to show that you weren't. This is the result of technological and also social change, and we're going to have to live with it. I think the best thing to do is to make sure that your strong media outlets like Sky News, for example, we do our best to make sure that in that sort of competitive environment that they get a fair crack of the whip and a chance to show that they're real. And that starts perhaps with, for example, if you're running the Pentagon, making sure that your reputable defence correspondents have passes that means they can get into the Pentagon and go to news conferences, which I'm afraid is not the case at the moment.
Deborah and Elizabeth, do either of you have anything to add to that, or can we leave that?
It was just more just to say that the fake news label, that I totally agree with Edward, it gets thrown against news that you don't like. It creates this incredibly hostile environment to be a journalist. And I wonder whether my young self would even want. I've always wanted to be a journalist ever since I was about 6 years old, and I've been so privileged to be able to have this profession. But it can be so hostile out there. You get attacked online, you get attacked in the street, and you're just trying to do your job. And especially when information gets weaponized, and it kind of fits on with what Elizabeth was saying about how media, we're part of, the information is part of the weapon system that hostile states will use. And so there really needs to be a real fundamental understanding inside newsrooms about how information can be weaponized and what you can do to counter against that. And obviously at the moment we're in this period where it's not peace, but it's not war. It's this grey zone in between. If we were, God forbid, if it was going to escalate to the UK being in a war, then you would, of course, I imagine, see the same kind of media restrictions that are in place in Ukraine, for example, where there is tight control over the release of information that would give the enemy, in Russia, an advantage, which is understandable in a war. But in the UK at the moment, there isn't that, of course, in place. We're an open liberal democracy, and in that space, that freedom can be weaponized against us to undermine our democracy, which is a really difficult area because you want to retain that freedom, but at the same time, you don't want to be exploited. So it's difficult.
Thank you. With any final words?
I think this is an opportunity to give people agency. So if we look at news consumers of news from traditional news outlets and social media, how are they supposed to be able to verify what the facts are? They haven't been equipped with it, and that's why I think probably the people who have the most potential to be able to withstand so-called fake news or unfactual information are young children, because they are likely to be taught information literacy, and I hope that becomes part of the curriculum in England and Wales and indeed across the UK. Because with that, you don't have to rely on others to report the correct facts. You can have the certainty that you yourself will be able to ascertain whether what you're consuming is accurate or not. And by the way, I would love to see something like an annual competition for 17-year-olds to spot the falsehoods in selected social media posts. I think we would discover that teenagers are a lot more a lot better equipped to spot falsehoods than we thought they were. But it starts with information literacy.
Thank you. Lady Hunt has got a quick supplementary before.
A very quick one for you, Miss Shaw. You mentioned the grey slip. Is that like a D notice? Is that the equivalent?
Yes.
Right.
In Sweden was called grey slip.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Lord Speller, very quickly, please.
Yeah. We've focused a bit on disinformation, but one of the problems for government in all these situations is they have to make decisions, they have to make them with inadequate time and insufficient information. By definition, they will get a number of those wrong. And then the media pile in on the person who's made the decision, U-turn, gaffe, demands for resignation, all the rest of it. And yet, if therefore this leads to people being reticent about making decisions, actually the system seizes up and your enemy has an advantage. How can we get beyond that?
Well, I think that the media always operates on the basis of where does an event fit into a pattern. And if you see that someone is basically highly competent, trustworthy, likeable, and they've done something wrong, you report that in a different way than if it's been a latest in a catalogue of disasters. And if you look at Finland, the national security reporting in Finland starts off on the basis that the Finnish state is there to protect everyone, and that the people making decisions are doing so with the national interest at heart. And so you don't get, and I wouldn't say that it's slavishly supportive, but you're left in no doubt when you talk to Finnish journalists that they care about national security. But that's the result of 70 years of hard work in making people feel that defence is everyone's priority. I don't think we've done that, and this kind of very sceptical, mistrustful media we have is partly the result of fragmentation in other parts of our public life.
Thank you. I think we must move on now to Lady Hellich,
Thank you, Chair,
because we've got a lot of questions to get through, and I'm aware we've only got you for an hour max. Lady Hellich.
Thank you, and thank you for your answer so far. I think mine is very broad, so you can say almost anything, but if you don't say the right thing, I'll come back to you. Is how can resilience be defined, and how might this shape or inform discussions across the country about tackling national and global risks and challenges?
Who would you like to start with?
Deborah?
Thank you. I think that it's a really good question, because if you make it too broad, then you just risk not, sort of losing people. I think in the context, so just in terms of where I'm coming from, it's about rebuilding resilience around the Article 3 ability to defend and deter an attack on the home front, and it's part of the national security strategy. The fact that the UK, it says now in black and white, this is a government document, that the UK needs to be prepared for the possibility of a direct threat, it uses the word threat rather than attack, on the home front as part of a wartime scenario. So that is actually now, that is the government's national security strategy. And the Chief of the Defence Staff, who I interviewed a couple of weeks ago, Air Chief Marshal Sir Rich Knighton, confirmed to me that the government, led by the Cabinet Office in this case, is producing a modern version of the War Book. That is a huge shift in what is being done behind the scenes in government in terms of an understanding. It really signals that awareness that we don't have the resilience as a nation to be able to withstand in the worst of crises. So we're talking about, a direct attack on the home front. So, I mean, we ran a war game podcast, which we did for a podcast series where we simulated a Russian armed attack on the UK and how the UK would respond. And in our scenario, it was ballistic and cruise missiles landing at key strategic sites across the country, and also landing on Oxford Street in London, and just exposing not just the lack of the military resilience in terms of air defences and the capacity of the armed forces to be able to fight a high intensity war for any meaningful length of time, but also societal resilience. And so in terms of responding to your question, I think it really is in this context. I think the Ministry of Defence, they understand resilience, they are relearning it, and they are producing their own national defence plan, which obviously is in coordination with NATO. But it's the societal resilience piece that is really missing. And it requires a huge shift in mindset when it talks about each individual family, just having having a sensible conversation about being ready to just be able to survive without electricity, without running water, without easy access to the internet for a period of it's like 72 hours, isn't it? 3 days. And that kind of communication and understanding, and then as well as that's the bottom level, and then up from that, a greater force. We used to have a civil defence force. There's been conversations about training civilians to have a role in the civil defence side of things, be that protecting critical infrastructure or being an extra capacity for the emergency services and the armed forces. I mean, that's been words, but so far no action. So a conversation on that side of things. And I just think at the moment there's an awareness that this needs to happen. There are conversations that are taking place behind closed doors, but there is not the resource there at the moment to enable to turn that action into a meaningful change. And then so far there hasn't been. There's obviously been attempts at it, a national dialogue, this national conversation on defence, on resilience, which obviously you as a committee are part of. Lord Robertson did an incredible intervention last week, but it's happening in sort of piecemeal in the vacuum where, unfortunately, the Cabinet Office at the moment is fairly silent, it seems.
Thank you.
Edward?
Yes, so I think resilience is partly about redundancy. So your system of committee room bookings is resilient because if there was a water leak here, you would be able to find another one. So the bad stuff will happen, whether it's accidents or hostile states or terrorists or whatever. And the first question is, does life go on? And then the second point is, can you control the damage? So if there was a mass casualty event, is the NHS overwhelmed or people are going to die in agony on stretchers in the street? The result of that is it builds confidence and cohesion. People think the system's going to work and they can then carry on and do their job and help other people do theirs, and you don't end up in a sort of serve keeper sort of world. And it also acts as a deterrent. And going back to Finland again, because Finland has such fantastic resilience in its everything from critical national infrastructure to society, it's a very hard target to attack because you could spend a lot of money attacking Finland and you wouldn't get anywhere. And in fact, last year, the Russians spent an entire year conducting an extensive information operation against Finland, which had absolutely no effect at all. In fact, I suspect that nobody on the committee has even noticed it, and it was barely reported inside Finland. So it acts as a deterrent. But it doesn't come free. It's a cost in money, it's a cost in time, and it's a cost in convenience. And we're all going to have to make big changes if we want to do this. And I'm afraid it's too late. We're already experiencing not just threats, but attacks. And even if we started today on rebuilding the sort of resilience that we had in this country decades ago, or that we do have in regard to some other threats like terrorism and cyber, even if we started right now, there's still an alarming gap. Russia has already, and China has already planted stuff on our networks. They have proxies roaming our streets. They have sabotage devices already planted, and they can attack us when they want, and there's not much we can do to defend. So therefore, we put a huge emphasis on our deterrent, which is unfortunately also lacking.
Elizabeth Braw.
Yes, you asked about the definition of resilience, and that is the ability to withstand and recover from damage. And it's the same thing for an individual as it is for a company or other organization, or indeed for a nation. And that really matters because it is what you have to do when harm occurs, but it's better to be able to have that ability before the harm occurs and before the damage occurs, so you can communicate, so you can signal to those wishing to cause that harm that you have the ability, so that they don't try it in the first place, which is why Finland has been doing what Edward just described. And so for the UK, as I said, for any free and open society, it's resilience building that is required in lots of different areas. And for example, if we look at healthcare, how would we treat a situation in which the NHS perhaps didn't get its medical supplies from China? We know what happened during COVID when those supplies were curtailed. What if it didn't get its generic drugs from India? What if countries whose citizens serve in the NHS decided to call those citizens home? And what if the armed forces had to compete with the NHS for medical supplies, drugs, and so forth? So that is in the crisis situation, but before the crisis situation occurs, you should ideally be able to communicate that we have thought about it and we have a plan, so don't even try it, because the cost is not going to be, the benefit is not going to be worth your cost. And that's where there is enormous opportunity, because not just does the NHS know about it, lots of companies in the UK know about it. They want to be part of the solution because they don't want to appear so vulnerable that somebody might try to attack them or harm them in other ways.
Thank you. Lady Hunter has the next question.
First of all, I thank you, all you journalists, and you, Deborah, the podcast, for just keeping this issue, in front of us all, because the threat and risk to this country, as some of you have said, is great, but it's not noticed. So thank you very much. Deborah, you raised, I can call you Deborah, I hope, yeah? You raised the 2026 survey conducted by Public First, saying that 40% of the public think that we're going to be at war within 5 years' time, but also that 42% of us feel no compulsion to do anything about it. So I wonder, if you, and I know, Ed, you think we should be much more cooperative and the media should be more cooperative with each other and we should liaise, government media more. But how do we galvanise everyone, on preparedness and resilience without causing alarm?
I can tell you.
So can I.
Okay.
Deborah first.
Please, yes, Deborah.
Well, I can just talk from a personal perspective. I think maybe that's kind of what really drives me at the moment, and it's quite emotional. I've got 3 children. I'm a middle-aged mum. I'm a civilian, but from a younger age, I used to live in Iraq, so I covered the Iraq War, and I saw a population of civilians under fire. Living with they'd had the aftermath of the US-led invasion, which then triggered that horrific sectarian carnage, the terrorist attacks, there'd be like the daily car bombs, and mums would be sending their children to school, not even knowing if their children would come home again. And I would come back to the UK. I'd spend several weeks over in Iraq, and then I'd come back to the UK for 2 or 3 weeks, and I would just be really struck. And it's through no fault of our own. People that, so my age, I'm going to be 50 this year. And so people of my age are now in positions of seniority across government, across industry, across society. And yet, as adults, we don't remember in any meaningful way. We don't remember the Cold War. We weren't adults during the Cold War. We can remember what we spoke to about our parents. Our grandparents fought in the Second World War. So we have memories of that. But we don't have a living memory of what it's like not to take our security for granted. And I think having been exposed to a country like Iraq, I've spent time in Afghanistan, I've spent time in Libya, and more recently I've spent a lot of time in Ukraine. I've had the unfortunate experience of really understanding how if you don't have security as a society, then there's no point in having conversations about education policy, hospitals, the economy even, because nothing matters if you don't have security. And we've lost that in the UK. And I think it was covering the full-scale invasion of Ukraine that really brought it home to me in a much more powerful way. I think because it's in Europe, it's on our doorstep. I can remember being in Kyiv on the 23rd of February, 2022, so the eve of the full-scale war. And I was reporting in the street, and I was standing outside this coffee shop. It was like a beautiful coffee shop. It had balloons outside. It had middle-aged mums like me having coffee inside. The very next day, their country was in a full-scale war, and their lives were completely upturned. I saw, people obviously left. Many people went and fought. Other people totally transformed their lives. Working in supermarkets under fire, working in power stations under fire, all part of this front line. And it just meant for me, in the UK, if we don't wake up to the reality of the need, as Edward and Elizabeth have said so eloquently, that resilience is about spare capacity and also about deterrence, then it will be too late. And a general once said to me that he fears that the only time that the UK will understand the importance of national defence and wider national resilience is when the attack happens, and then it is too late. And that really was the motivation, the driving motivation behind the podcast, to bring to life the reality of the threat so we can change. And yet we're not changing, and it's so frustrating. And I just think the language, the danger now is that the rhetoric you're hearing from government ministers is really strong, but it's not backed up by meaningful action. And so the public would be understandably right to think that things are happening, but they're not. So it's even more dangerous. The threat is growing, the rhetoric's getting more convincing, and yet the reality is still woefully inadequate.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Would you?
Yes. So I think that I grew up I was born in 62, and I remember the start of the IRA bombing campaign and the absolute shock that for the first time since the Blitz, bombs or V2s, bombs were going off on the British mainland. And we did change. We really did change. We gave, our state took on new powers. ours, and our behaviour changed. Nobody now leaves a bag unattended in a public place. That's a very irresponsible thing to do. So we had this mixture of governmental and societal change on that. And I think we've also seen it a bit on cyber, that people used to think cybersecurity was something frightfully complicated. And now people basically, the think before you click sort of ideas have begun to penetrate. And we've got the outward-facing bit of GCHQ, the National Cybersecurity Centre. 30 years ago, GCHQ was so secret you could barely mention its name, and now it's we know they're keeping us safe. So I think we can do this, but I think the most important thing to galvanise the public is the government's got to tell the truth, and they don't. They don't talk about the attacks that are going on all the time in this country, because if they did, they would be faced with two questions. One, how did you let this happen? And secondly, what are you going to do about it? And the answers to those are extremely embarrassing.
Thank you. Elizabeth Braw.
I think the answer is for the UK government to appoint a junior minister in charge of non-kinetic national security threats, and that would allow the government to have one person who communicates the threats facing this country on a daily basis and is as transparent as possible about it. Because you said, Baroness Hunter, that people don't know about it. No, they don't know about it because it's not communicated. I mean, it is communicated when a news organization decides to mention it, or when Ken McCallum holds his annual speech. But other than that, people don't really understand what is happening on a daily basis, and how could they? So if this government, or any government in the UK, had a junior minister in charge of non-kinetic national security threats, that person, who should be a good communicator, by the way, the best communicator on the Labour benches, if that person existed, then we would have somebody who could communicate on a daily basis. This is what's happening. Don't be alarmed. We are aware of what is happening, what is unfolding, what could unfold, and we are doing something about it, and ideally something should be done about it as well, so that that person had something to communicate. But as things stand, and I think this comes also to Lord Speller's question, people are very cynical because they see bits and pieces, fragments of news in various places, and they conclude that the government is doing nothing. Well, I am convinced that this is a career opportunity for a talented communicator. So perhaps not for a member of this committee, since you have already paid your dues in government and similar organisations, but for a member of the new intake.
Thank you. Lady Northover has the next question, and could I just say that if we're going to get through everybody's questions, both members and witnesses must be brief, please. Thank you.
And part of this has been answered, I think. Without a direct military threat to the UK, how can the public be encouraged to develop the same level of preparedness and resilience as we see in the Nordic countries? And I wondered if, Edward, you've mentioned the Nordic countries in particular. I wonder if you could perhaps expand a little bit about what we might learn, what we might do, therefore, which learns from what the Nordic countries have managed to do.
I hesitate to answer that, given that I have the most distinguished Nordic presence in this country sitting next to me, and for Elizabeth from Sweden.
She can sweep up everything after you've contributed.
And first of all, I say it's not just Nordic, it's Baltics, and in some respects the Baltics are ahead of the Nordics, and some of the Nordics are severely lagging and having to catch up and not doing a very good job catching up. So Finland is an exemplar, Lithuania, Estonia also have and of course Latvia have important things to contribute. So I would say a couple of things that we could do at very little cost starting today. One is to introduce Finnish-style national defence courses. These are 3 to 4 week off-site courses for senior decision makers across the whole of society, government, business, the lot. And they get together and they work through a difficult scenario where they have to work together, and they're also briefed on the sort of threats facing this country. Now, I've suggested trying to do it here. The immediate problem we run into is classification, that the sort of things that they're briefed on are the sort of thing you can't be briefed on without a security clearance. And I'm not talking about Ambassador to Washington sort of security clearance. So we would have to reshape our system a bit. It comes at a cost in time. These are senior people with busy schedules. They take time out. But the Finns have been doing this for decades, and the result is they have thousands of people who both know each people outside their own silo and have a very good idea of what sort of threats they could face. We're quite good at training people. We have the Royal College of Defence Studies, we have other things. We could start doing that quite quickly. It won't come in time for the shock that's heading towards us, but still better late than never. I'd also say one other thing, soft target protection, that if you are a think tanker, a journalist, a campaigner doing something in Finland or one of these other countries where you get onto the list of the Russians or the Chinese and they don't like you, you get looked after in a way that you don't get looked after in this country.
Thank you.
Elizabeth.
Yes, so one area that I think could easily be, one measure that could easily be adopted and adapted by the UK is the Swedish list of companies that are critical in a crisis situation. So it's they are called K companies, but could be any label. But the point is they are critical, and that list is constantly maintained, more so during the Cold War, but now once again, and that means that they have special provisions. So, for example, if a key manufacturing company, or key bank, whatever, would need to be able to operate without disruption in a crisis situation, they should be set up accordingly in peacetime. And if that costs more, it's subsidized by the government. But you have to have that list, and you have to figure out beforehand what the companies are, specific sectors and specific companies within each sector. But that's an incredibly powerful thing to be able to communicate to the world that you have it figured out and that your economy will keep going no matter what. Because even if the worst were to come, you have underground manufacturing sites for your key manufacturing companies, and it all starts with having that list, and of course with the list comes constant communication with executives, and I think 10 years ago it would have been a difficult ask to go out to CEOs and chairmen of privately owned companies or listed companies, especially in this country, and say, well, you have to be a part of the national effort. Now I don't think it's such a difficult ask, because they are all aware that they are the new front line and that they can't fully defend themselves on their own, and that the best defense they have is as part of the national defense.
So like in Japan, where every crane is registered as to where it is, just in case there's an earthquake.
Exactly. And on that note, I won't be long, since you mentioned the timekeeping, but there is so much that we can learn in the national security space from earthquake zones. I myself got my start in resilience by living in San Francisco, which is an earthquake zone.
Deborah Haynes, do you have anything to add to that one?
I do, and I found it really interesting, because you always focus on the Nordics, rightly so, on the Nordics and the Baltic states and their incredible resilient population and philosophy. But really, and like, it's like, well, they're really close to the threat, so it's like understandable why they would be so much more mindful and their society so much more willing to adopt these different measures. But really interesting, in the last 2 years, the Netherlands and Canada, so two countries that that you can really sort of, in terms of how we've all let our guard down since the end of the Cold War and reap the benefits of the peace dividend and live far away enough from Russia not to feel the threat breathing down our neck in terms of it being right next door. Both of those countries have reinstituted national resilience programs. In the Netherlands, they've got this very ambitious program. It's just starting, but to build up basic training for civilians. The same in Canada. In the Netherlands, there's even like a freedom tax, I think it's called, that they're using to fund this increase in defence and resilience. And I just think, isn't that interesting that those two countries have taken that next step, which I really hope would help motivate our government to do the same.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. Let's move on to Lady Winterton's question now, please.
Yeah, could I take you to the issue of democratic resilience? We've heard quite a lot about misinformation during elections, particularly in countries like Moldova. There's some evidence of this occurring, and there is a a debate, obviously, particularly about social media, between what we can do to counter misinformation and whether there's a tension between that and freedom of speech. There is not a lot of reporting about this issue, and I wondered to what extent you feel perhaps there should be greater emphasis on interference in elections and potential for interference in our elections, and how it might be countered through the media, particularly social media, and what role you think that journalism might have to play in that.
Well, can I go first on this? The reason you don't read a lot about this is that there are rich, powerful people who put money into our political system for their own purposes, and they're very litigious. And we have these things called SLAPs, which stands for Strategic Lawsuit Against Public Participation. You can have a story which is complete copper bottom, you'll win if it comes to court, but the cost of going to court will bankrupt you or your news organisation, so therefore you either don't publish it or you retract it. And this happens again and again and again. And there's an admirable organisation called the Anti-SLAP Coalition which deals with that. So I think we are, or fails to deal with that because the government hasn't found parliamentary time for it. And so that's one major problem. Behind that is the question, the broader question of dirty money, and we need legislation to keep dirty money and anonymous money and crypto money out of our political system. And at the moment it's wide open for people who want to buy influence, or even, dare I say it, a place in the House of Lords. I was the first witness to the ISC, Intelligence and Security Committee, Russia inquiry, and I was able to tell them things that I can't tell you here about things that Russia gets up to. One of the things that came out of their belated Russia report is that the security service, MI5, is very hesitant about doing this. They haven't really looked at Russian, and for that matter also Chinese influence in our politics, because they're very nervous about running operations that have come close to live politics. So we are wide open to this, and it's far more than just a bit of disinformation on social media.
I was going to just say that, yeah, absolutely what Edward is saying, like, on steroids, I completely agree with him. It's a really difficult area to counter, but in terms, there is reporting on it. So I would push back on that in that sense that we're not reporting on it at all. There is greater awareness of it. It is slowly growing, but it is incredibly difficult, as Edward said, to navigate the potential legalities around certain things that you know to be true, but it's very difficult to prove. I'm not plugging Sky News, but we did a podcast series a few years ago called Into the Grey Zone, which was an attempt, again, it's about educating. It was an attempt to try to make people understand that the way that countries can attack you, it won't be just through bombs and bullets, but it can be through information campaigns, hack and leak. That's a really big one as well to think about when you have, like, Russia, like the FSB, they hacked an organization called the Integrity Initiative. It was run by a very esteemed expert, hacked that, then leaked the information, directly designed to discredit and destroy a really effective counter disinformation campaign that actually was doing really good work for the Foreign Office. So it's a really dangerous, corrosive weapon. And it was interesting, I've seen over the years, over the last sort of 5 or so years, 5 years ago, there was like such a huge hole in the government side of things about who is responsible for dealing with it. Is it MI5? Is it GCHQ? Is it the NCSC? Is it the NCA? And now there does seem to be, MI5 does seem to be stepping up more into this space, willing to do more to counter information, hostile state information campaigns. But it's a huge effort, and they lack the resource to be able to do it at the scale that it's being done to us. So it is a massive vulnerability that really needs greater awareness about.
Elizabeth Pro?
2 quick points. The first is that as happens in some countries, there should be some sort of government entity that monitors disinformation, then calls it out, and possibly it could be the junior minister who I would like to see appointed who should call it out, so that people are aware of it.
The Electoral Commission does do a bit of that, actually.
Yes. So, what if we had an organisation, or even a part of an organisation that does that comprehensively, and it would have to be only disinformation emanating from abroad? So that because otherwise you get into really complicated conversations about stifling of public debate at home. But there is enough disinformation emanating from abroad that entity would be very busy, and then we should call it out. And then the other thing I would love to see happen is for leading influencers to be invited to see how established news organizations work, because if you don't know how they work, then you are likely to suspect them of not covering the sort of things you are interested in for nefarious reasons. And if you were invited to see how a news conference or the news conference within a news organization works, then you would realize that actually they go through a lot of topics, and they choose the ones that are most likely to get attention. And there's nothing nefarious about it. But I think news organizations just have to become more open to the public to show this is how we work, and you don't have to worry that we're bearing news. No, it's just a competitive environment.
Thank you. Lord Peach.
Thank you. Hello, everybody, and nice to see you all again. We are an open economy as well as open politics. And to speculate slightly on the current situation in the Middle East, maybe we're seeing the consequences of a just-in-time economic system and the lack of resilience in our global economy. So I wondered what lessons you are drawing from your experience and knowledge about that, and whether you've got any thoughts for us on either military, bearing in mind we all know what was in the SDR, but now the world has revealed itself in an even a darker way, and whether joining us in our deliberations about whether it's time to actually energise the thought of civil defence in the UK.
Elizabeth Brawl, would you like to start on that?
Yes. As you were speaking, I thought back to the earthquake in Japan in 2011, the Fukushima incident, and I remember it vividly because what it did, it caused lots of damage. But one aspect I thought was particularly fascinating, which was that the Japanese factory that makes the sort of glittery stuff that goes on into the paint on cars, that factory was damaged. I had to close because of the earthquake and the tsunami, and that meant that cars with that glittery paint could not be delivered because the glittery paint clearly was missing, and it was missing because there was only one factory, one company making this glittery component for car paint. And at the time, it seemed like, an earthquake doesn't happen that often, so we don't have to worry about single sourcing. Well, now we do have to worry about single sourcing. And I think the upside is that companies have discovered they have to worry about single sourcing, and to a larger extent, they are not single sourcing anymore. And it is more expensive to have dual sources, essentially backup source of two contracts, but it is a whole lot better than having disruptions, which is the alternative. And the upside of that companies are discovering in using dual sources or essentially multiplying their contracts is that you can then show your clients and customers and potential clients and customers, and indeed your shareholders, that you will be able to keep operating even in the face of disruption. That is an incredible competitive advantage which more and more companies are realizing that they can capitalize on. And obviously there is nothing positive in talking about disruption and especially disruption caused by war. But if you're a company, you have to be able to show that you are competitive under any circumstances. And so that is the advantage, I think, of building resilience into your plans, that even though it is more expensive for your customers at any given moment, if you build resilience into your strategy, your clients, your customers can be reasonably certain that you will deliver what it is they are paying for it, regardless of how the circumstances develop.
I think the model that all business people understand is insurance, and you insure against risks that would be crippling if the event happened. And moving from a just-in-time to a just-in-case model is expensive, but it's a kind of insurance. And I think we could do a bit more to highlight fragility and to make sure that companies that willfully go for sort of low-cost fragility are exposed a bit. You can imagine a sort of rating system for resilience that you could bring in. We already do this with modern slavery. If you any kind of supplier, you have to fill in a modern slavery thing. So I think there's plenty we can do. It needs leadership from the top, and when the government visibly doesn't take resilience seriously in its own doings, it's going to be very hard to persuade businesses to take on the cost and inconvenience of doing so as well.
Just on the military front, I think it was really interesting watching this all play out. I mean, obviously horrific, but to see that the Navy struggling to get a single warship out of Portsmouth, that was like the absolute illustration of hollowed out armed forces being played out in the middle of a war. I mean, thankfully not a war that was actually on our shores, but one that we were having to respond to. And that, I thought, really cut through into the public conscience. I mean, yes, of course, it cut through to Donald Trump's conscience too, unfortunately. But in terms of the public being made to understand what it means to have a hollow force and the risk that we as an entire country are holding, because, the country much of the public doesn't have to think about defence. They would understand if they couldn't get hospital appointments, but they don't understand what the risk is if their army doesn't have enough bullets to last a single day in battle. So I think the sight of HMS Dragon struggling to leave port, that really cut through in a way that should be capitalised on, and obviously by inside defence. But unfortunately, you're still having those meaningless sound bites from the ministers when they talk about how they're moving at pace to get their defence investment plan. It's just, they're not, rather than actually gripping it and saying, yes, this is urgent, we need to fundamentally shift our mindset, fundamentally accelerate the plan around the defence review. It's still business as usual, and that's just not good enough.
Or even the Defence Readiness Bill, which would be the absolute first step towards this.
Thank you.
And we recommend that at pace should be a disciplinary matter for any minister.
Yes. And last question is from Lord Oates.
Thank you, and thank you for a fascinating evidence session. My question is, if you had only one recommendation to give to government on preparedness and resilience, what would your absolute priority be? Perhaps we could start with Deborah.
Well, actually, I was Elizabeth talked about the junior minister to talk about hybrid, but I was thinking that because this is an all-of-nation effort, I think you actually need like a national resilience minister, who's a Secretary of State for national resilience, who has the authority to ensure that all government departments are part of this, because the Cabinet Office is leading on this, and there isn't the visible heft behind that. So if you actually had a Secretary of State whose job it would give that elevated importance, that whole of government understanding of it, and then we get somewhere.
Thank you.
Elizabeth, sorry.
Yes, I'll come back to my junior minister in charge of... a minister on any level, just a minister who owns the portfolio.
I'd do some snap exercises and just imagine that we'd had a massive hostile state cyber attack, or some other really bad disruptive event, and it would show how woefully ill-prepared we are. But that would be the only point of doing it, as Lord Peach will know. The point about military exercises is not to show off, it's to test yourself, and we should start testing ourselves, and we would find out how bad things are, and then we might do something about it. But at the moment we're living in la-la land, pretending that what we're doing is brilliant.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, we've made it at pace or otherwise. Thank you, all three of you, very much indeed. That's been really helpful, and we're very grateful for your time.
We wish you success in your efforts.
Thank you. I can now close the public session.